Hey, dreamer. Welcome to Sleep Theory. Before we drift off, tell me in the comments where you're tuning in from. Tap that like button and subscribe. It helps the algorithm share this with more people like us.
What if a single sentence could shatter everything you thought you knew? What if truth was a lie? What if freedom was a cage you couldn't see? From Descartes to Nietzsche, from ancient wisdom to modern chaos, these 30 philosophical ideas didn't just change how we think. They changed who we are. Some ideas don't just challenge the world, they rewrite your place in it. If something here shifts how you see the world, like the video, and subscribe for more. I think, therefore I am. Few phrases in the history of philosophy have had such a profound and lasting impact. These three Latin words, cogito, ergo sum, written by René Descartes in the 17th century, marked a radical turning point in the way we understand existence, knowledge, and the self. At a time when traditional beliefs were crumbling under the weight of scientific discovery and religious upheaval, Descartes set out to find something absolutely certain, a foundation for all knowledge that could not be doubted. His method was simple but revolutionary: to doubt everything. He questioned the reliability of the senses, the certainty of memory, even the existence of the physical world. What if everything he had ever known was a dream? What if some powerful force, a demon perhaps, was deceiving him at every moment? In this sea of doubt, only one truth remained undeniable. The very act of doubting, of thinking, proved that there must be a thinker. Even if everything else was false, the fact that he was thinking meant that he existed, at least as a conscious mind. From this insight came the cogito, a new philosophical foundation rooted not in observation, but in introspection. It was not meant as a boast about intelligence, but as a lifeline, a single point of certainty in a world stripped bare by skepticism. For Descartes, this realization defined the self as a res cogitans, a thinking thing. But his assertion would go on to shape not only modern philosophy, but the very notion of identity in Western thought. It placed reason and consciousness at the center of what it means to be human. However, the cogito also sparked centuries of criticism and debate. Some argued that Descartes had created an artificial separation between the mind and the body, a dualism that would haunt philosophy and science for generations. Others, like David Hume, challenged the very existence of a unified self behind the thinking. To Hume, what we call the self is merely a bundle of perceptions, fleeting, disconnected, with no underlying substance. Friedrich Nietzsche went even further, suggesting that Descartes had smuggled in assumptions hidden within language. I think already implies an I, he argued. But what if the thought comes first, and the I is merely its effect? Still, despite these challenges, the cogito endures, not because it solves every problem, but because it provides a powerful place to start. In a world saturated with information, opinions, and illusions, the ability to reflect, to become aware of one's own thinking, is still a kind of clarity. Descartes' insight resonates today in unexpected ways. In an age of artificial intelligence, virtual identities, and digital lives, we are constantly confronted with questions about what it means to be real. Can a machine that mimics human language be said to think? If a virtual self can feel real, does it exist in any meaningful sense? Descartes reminds us that it is not appearance nor behavior, but awareness, the internal experience of thought, that grounds our being. And yet, the cogito has limits. It proves that we exist, but not who we are or what we ought to do with our existence. It is a beginning, not a destination. The ethical, emotional, and social dimensions of life remain untouched by this initial certainty. We still must ask, how should we live? What gives life meaning? How do we connect with others who are also thinking beings, behind eyes we can never fully see into? Descartes gives us the first brick, but the structure must be built by us. Even so, his legacy persists, especially in moments of existential doubt. When the world feels chaotic, when identities blur, when we lose sight of the path forward, The cogito remains a quiet affirmation. If I can think, I am still here. That awareness, no matter how small or uncertain, is enough to begin again. It is not a full answer to the mysteries of life, but it is a signpost in the dark, a reminder that consciousness, fragile as it may be, is the most intimate form of truth we have. And every time we stop to reflect, to question, to wonder, we reaffirm our presence in the unfolding story of existence. The only thing I know is that I know nothing. At first glance, the phrase seems contradictory. How can someone know that they know nothing and still claim to know something at all? Yet this statement, often attributed to Socrates, lies at the very heart of philosophy itself. It is not an admission of ignorance, but rather a radical form of honesty, a recognition that human knowledge is limited, fallible, and often illusory. In the ancient world of Athens, Socrates stood apart from the sophists and self-proclaimed experts who claimed to possess truth. Instead of preaching answers, he asked questions, not to confuse, but to uncover assumptions. Through what would later be called the Socratic method, he engaged others in dialogues, drawing out their beliefs, examining their logic, and slowly revealing the contradictions within. He was not trying to win arguments. He was trying to awaken thought. When the Oracle of Delphi declared that no one was wiser than Socrates, he was puzzled. He didn't think of himself as wise at all. But as he searched for someone wiser, politicians, poets, craftsmen, he discovered a strange pattern. Those who claimed to know the most often understood the least. They spoke with certainty about justice, virtue, the soul, the gods. Yet under questioning, their claims collapsed. And in that realization, Socrates found the meaning behind the oracle's words. He was the wisest, not because he knew more, but because he knew he didn't know. That is the essence of philosophical humility. True wisdom, in this view, is not having all the answers. It's being aware of the limits of your understanding. This idea has echoed through the centuries, influencing countless thinkers. It challenges the human tendency toward intellectual pride, dogma, and rigid ideology. It reminds us that certainty can be dangerous, not only in philosophy, but in politics, science, religion, and everyday life. When people believe they already know the truth, they stop listening, they stop questioning, they stop learning. Socrates' declaration is an antidote to that arrogance. It invites curiosity, wonder, and reflection. It opens the door to a life that is not just about acquiring facts, but about living thoughtfully. In modern times, the quote has taken on new relevance. In an era dominated by information, where knowledge is a few clicks away and opinions are shouted louder than ever, the illusion of understanding is everywhere. People mistake access to information for wisdom. They mistake confidence for correctness. But Socrates would urge us to pause, to ask, do I really know what I think I know? Have I questioned it deeply? Have I seen it from other sides? His method wasn't just about exposing others. It was about self-examination. He believed that the unexamined life was not worth living, not because comfort or success are unworthy, but because without reflection, we risk living a life that is shallow, reactive, and untrue to ourselves. The statement, "I know that I know nothing," also carries an ethical dimension. It teaches intellectual humility, a rare trait in any age. It encourages us to engage others not with the intent to defeat them, but to understand them. It reminds us that even the people we disagree with might hold a piece of the truth we're missing. And it challenges us to speak with honesty about our uncertainties, rather than pretending to possess more than we do. Even in science, where progress is real and measurable, the spirit of Socratic humility persists. Great discoveries often begin with great doubt. Einstein once said, "The more I learn, the more I realize how much I don't know." In that sense, Socrates' insight is not a rejection of knowledge, it is its foundation. Because only when we acknowledge what we don't know can we begin to truly learn. The quote also serves as a mirror. When we hear it, we are forced to look inward. What do I believe I know? Where did that knowledge come from? Have I tested it, challenged it, or simply absorbed it from others. In a time of algorithmic certainty, when we are constantly shown content that confirms our biases, Socratic thinking offers an act of quiet rebellion. It invites discomfort. It asks us to sit with doubt, and in doing so, it reawakens our ability to think independently. Socrates never wrote a book. All we know of him comes from others, mainly his student Plato. And yet, his legacy outlives empires. Not because he gave us conclusions, but because he gave us a method, relentless inquiry, humility in the face of complexity, and the courage to admit that even our most cherished beliefs might be incomplete. To live as Socrates did is not to walk around denying everything. It is to walk through the world with eyes open, aware that truth is not a possession, but a pursuit, and that in this pursuit we become not only wiser, but more human. The only thing I know is that I know nothing, and that perhaps is the beginning of everything worth knowing. God is dead. Few statements in philosophy have sparked as much confusion, fear, and misinterpretation as this one. Written by Friedrich Nietzsche in the late 19th century, it is not a celebration, nor a literal claim about a divine being's demise, but a cultural and existential diagnosis. To understand what Nietzsche meant, we must first understand the world he lived in, a world in transition. Europe was moving from centuries of religious dominance into an age of science, secularism, and industrial progress. The Enlightenment had elevated reason, and Darwin had shaken the foundations of creation. Yet despite all these shifts, society still clung to religious values, to moral codes rooted in a belief system that fewer and fewer people genuinely believed. Nietzsche's proclamation, "God is dead," first appeared in The Gay Science, and later, more famously, in Thus Spoke Zarathustra. But the line is most powerfully expressed in a parable from The Gay Science, where a madman runs into a marketplace shouting that God is dead and that we have killed him. The people around him laugh, not understanding. The madman isn't celebrating, he is grieving. He realizes that modern society has outgrown the belief in God, but has not yet come to terms with the consequences. What Nietzsche foresaw and feared was that the death of God would create a moral vacuum. If traditional religious frameworks no longer guide us, then where do our values come from? What happens when the old absolutes disappear, but we haven't created new ones? His warning was not about theology. It was about meaning, purpose, and the future of humanity. Nietzsche believed that many people were living in contradiction, discarding the metaphysical beliefs of religion while still clinging to its moral and ethical structures. In doing so, they were, in his view, living on borrowed time. The foundation had been removed, but the building still stood, for now. God is dead was a wake-up call, a confrontation with the idea that we, as a civilization, could no longer rely on inherited truths. But it is not simply a nihilistic cry. Nietzsche did not want to destroy meaning. He wanted to rebuild it. He introduced the idea of the Übermensch, or overman, a figure who would go beyond good and evil as defined by religious norms and create values of his own. The death of God, then, was not the end, but a dangerous, necessary beginning. It was an opportunity to reimagine what it means to live a meaningful life. Yet Nietzsche was aware of the risks. Without a shared foundation, people might turn to nationalism, consumerism, or blind ideology to fill the void. He feared the rise of what he called the last man, a figure who seeks only comfort, routine, and shallow pleasures, avoiding any real confrontation with life's deeper questions. In many ways, Nietzsche's prophecy seems disturbingly accurate. The 20th century, following his death, was marked by ideological extremism, world wars, and existential crisis. And even today, many feel that the structures that once gave life, a sense of coherence, religion, tradition, community, are eroding, leaving behind anxiety, isolation, and spiritual confusion. But Nietzsche's philosophy is not without hope. The death of God may dismantle inherited systems, but it also challenges us to live more authentically. Instead of accepting meaning passively, we are called to create it actively, to take responsibility for our values, our actions, and our lives. For Nietzsche, this task was heroic. It required strength, creativity, and the courage to face life's uncertainties without illusion. In a sense, God is dead is one of the most deeply human statements in philosophy. It acknowledges our loss, not just of faith, but of cosmic reassurance. And it asks, now that the old gods have fallen silent, what kind of life will you choose to live? Will you retreat into old dogmas and distractions, or will you dare to write your own scripture? However imperfect and mortal it may be, Nietzsche's work is often misread as purely destructive, but at its core, it is deeply constructive, a passionate call to become who we are without relying on external absolutes. It's a philosophy that doesn't offer easy answers, but demands that we take the difficult questions seriously. And perhaps that is why his voice continues to echo, because he was willing to ask what others feared to confront. If the stories that shaped our world no longer hold, then what shall we become in their absence? What shall we believe, and how shall we live? Man is born free, and everywhere he is in chains. With this single sentence, Jean-Jacques Rousseau opened one of the most provocative political works of the 18th century, The Social Contract. And in doing so, he posed a question that still echoes today. If human beings are born with the capacity for freedom, why is so much of our lives shaped by constraint, inequality, and obedience? Rousseau lived in an age where monarchy, aristocracy, and social hierarchy were considered natural and unquestionable. But he saw through these structures and asked instead, what if the systems we take for granted are the very things that enslave us? For Rousseau, the chains were not only physical or political, they were also psychological, cultural, and social. From a young age, individuals are conditioned to conform, to obey rules, follow customs, and accept roles they did not choose. Yet beneath all that conditioning lies a deeper truth. The human being, in their natural state, is free, unbound by artificial laws, uncorrupted by social expectations. Rousseau believed that civilization, for all its progress, had distorted human nature. Where earlier philosophers like Hobbes saw pre-civilized humanity as savage and dangerous, Rousseau argued the opposite, that humans in the state of nature were peaceful, self-sufficient, and morally neutral. It was society, with its emphasis on property, status, and competition, that introduced inequality and corruption. This was a radical claim, and it challenged the legitimacy of governments and power structures across Europe. But Rousseau wasn't advocating for a return to the wild. He knew that society was here to stay. Instead, he asked, can we build a social order that preserves freedom rather than destroys it? His answer was the idea of the general will, a collective agreement where individuals, by participating in the creation of laws, submit to no one but themselves. True freedom, he argued, does not mean doing whatever one wants. It means living under laws that one has given oneself, alongside others. It is not the absence of restraint, but the alignment of personal interest with the common good. In this way, Rousseau tried to resolve a deep paradox: how to be both an individual and part of a collective, how to preserve liberty in a world that requires cooperation. But his solution was not without its critics. The idea of the general will has been used and misused in history, sometimes twisted into a justification for authoritarianism in the name of the collective. And yet, Rousseau's core insight remains powerful, that many of the structures we assume to be natural, social class, economic inequality, political authority, are in fact human-made and can be reimagined. The chains we wear are not forged by nature, but by history, and they can be broken, not by chaos, but by conscious reform. Rousseau's thought also speaks to modern life in subtler ways. Today, the chains are less visible, not royal decrees or feudal lords, but algorithms, debts, schedules, performance reviews, social expectations, and economic pressures. We are told we are free, and yet we feel trapped by bills, by roles, by definitions of success we did not choose. We move through systems that reward obedience and punish dissent, and we wonder why we feel disconnected. Rousseau would say, because we have lost the link between our inner freedom and the world we live in. To reclaim it, we must first see the chains for what they are. And then, through dialogue, cooperation, and courage, we must imagine new forms of life together. His vision is idealistic, but not naive. He knew that freedom is fragile and that many would choose comfort or order over autonomy. But he also believed in education, in the power of civic engagement, and in the possibility of transforming society from the ground up. In the end, Rousseau's famous line is both a critique and a call. It reminds us that we are born with more potential than we often realize, and that many of the limits we face are not fate, but design. And if they are designed, they can be redesigned. Freedom is not something we inherit. It is something we must continually rebuild. Together, the unexamined life is not worth living. With this quiet but thunderous statement, Socrates left behind one of the most enduring challenges in the history of thought. He reportedly spoke these words at his trial, as recorded by his student, Plato, in the Apology, when offered the chance to save his life through silence or exile. Instead of retreating from his mission, he chose death, insisting that a life lived without reflection, without self-awareness, without questioning one's own beliefs and actions, was no true life at all. At first, the phrase may sound harsh, not worth living. Is it really so extreme? But for Socrates, philosophy was not a luxury. It was a way of being. In a world filled with assumptions, conventions, and inherited truths, he believed it was the duty of every person to turn inward, to ask hard questions, and to live deliberately. His method, the Socratic method, was built on dialogue, on exposing contradictions, on peeling back the surface of opinions to reach something deeper. He did not claim to have the answers. In fact, his wisdom came from knowing what he didn't know. But he understood that without examination, we live according to scripts we did not write, shaped by the beliefs of others, by habit, by fear, by untested tradition. To examine life, in Socrates' view, is to reclaim agency. It is to interrupt the automatic flow of days and ask, what do I believe and why? What am I living for? What kind of person am I becoming? It is a process of making the unconscious conscious, of bringing light into the parts of ourselves we often ignore. This kind of examination isn't reserved for philosophers. It's something anyone can do quietly, in solitude or in conversation. And it doesn't require books or degrees, only the willingness to reflect, to question, to change. Socrates lived in Athens during a time of political instability, where democratic ideals clashed with corruption, where the line between truth and persuasion blurred. In that environment, he saw the danger of citizens who did not think critically, who followed rhetoric over reason, who accepted easy answers, who were swayed by appearance rather than essence. His trial was, in many ways, the result of his refusal to stop questioning. But his death became his final teaching. That philosophy, the love of wisdom, is not abstract or detached, but woven into the fabric of a meaningful life. In our time, the relevance of his words has only grown. The pace of modern life often leaves little room for reflection. We are surrounded by noise, distractions, endless streams of content and opinion. We are urged to optimize, to consume, to perform. But rarely are we invited to stop, truly stop and examine, to sit with discomfort, to question our values, our choices, our motivations. Yet it is in those moments, quiet and searching, that the examined life begins. And it is not always easy. Examining our lives can reveal contradictions we'd rather not face. It can uncover habits that no longer serve us, relationships that lack truth, beliefs we've inherited but never truly understood. But through that discomfort comes growth. Through self-examination, we become authors of our lives rather than passive participants. We begin to live with intention rather than inertia. Socrates was not offering a judgment, but an invitation. a call to live more fully, more honestly, more awake. The examined life is not about achieving perfection or finding absolute answers. It is about cultivating awareness. It is about living with your eyes open, willing to adjust course when needed, to admit fault, to pursue truth even when it's inconvenient. In this sense, the examined life is not just worth living. It is the path to what makes life meaningful. Without it, we risk moving through time without ever truly arriving in ourselves. We risk success without fulfillment, action without understanding, motion without direction. To examine one's life is not to withdraw from the world, but to engage with it more deeply. It is to ask not just what we are doing, but why we are doing it, and what kind of world we are helping to shape through our choices. And so, Socrates' words remain, not as a warning, but as a compass. They remind us that every day offers a chance to reflect, to learn, to become. And perhaps in that quiet act of examination, we find not just ourselves, but the very essence of what it means to be human. That which does not kill us makes us stronger. These words, by Friedrich Nietzsche, have echoed far beyond the world of philosophy, becoming one of the most quoted and perhaps most misinterpreted lines in modern culture. They are often used as a rallying cry, a form of encouragement, a simple motivational phrase. But behind their simplicity lies a much deeper, more complex idea. Nietzsche wrote this line in Twilight of the Idols, a book he composed late in life, while enduring physical pain, isolation, and the early signs of his mental decline. It was not a slogan for the comfortable, but a reflection forged in suffering. At its core, the quote is not about avoiding pain, but about how we confront it, and what it can become in the process. Nietzsche believed that hardship was not merely an obstacle, but a catalyst. Suffering, he argued, has the potential to refine us, to awaken us, to force us into growth. When we survive something that could have broken us, we do not remain the same. We are changed, not always visibly, not always immediately, but inwardly, where it matters most. This is not the same as saying all suffering is good. Nietzsche was no naive optimist. He understood the darkness of life. He struggled with illness, loss, and alienation. But unlike many thinkers who sought to escape suffering through reason, faith, or detachment, Nietzsche stared directly into it. He asked what could be drawn from it, not avoided. In this, his thinking parallels the forging of steel, an image he admired. Just as metal is hardened through heat and pressure, the human spirit can gain resilience through adversity. But this strength is not automatic. Not everyone becomes stronger through pain. Nietzsche was careful to imply that growth is a possibility, not a guarantee. The difference lies in how we face the experience. Do we resist it blindly, deny it, collapse under it? Or do we wrestle with it, integrate it, learn from it, even if it leaves us scarred? In Nietzsche's view, the greatest individuals are not those who avoid struggle, but those who are transformed by it. He admired figures who embraced hardship, who created meaning through it. His concept of the Übermensch, or overman, is not a superhuman in the physical sense, but someone who rises above despair by forging their own values, their own strength, from the chaos of life. In this way, suffering becomes creative, not in a romanticized sense, but in a deeply personal, existential way. It becomes the soil in which character, depth, and authenticity grow. In our time, Nietzsche's insight finds echoes in psychology and trauma studies. Resilience research shows that some individuals, after going through major life difficulties, illness, loss, betrayal, failure, report not just recovery, but post-traumatic growth, a deeper appreciation for life, stronger relationships, a more focused sense of purpose. This does not mean the suffering was good or desired. It means that what breaks us can also reveal what we're made of, and that sometimes strength is not loud or heroic. It's quiet, it's enduring, it's the ability to get up again, changed but unbowed. Still, Nietzsche's quote must be approached with care. It should never be used to dismiss someone's pain or pressure them into being stronger. Not all wounds heal into wisdom. Some leave damage that takes years to understand, and some never truly fade. Strength, in Nietzsche's sense, is not about denial. It's about transformation. It is not about pretending we're unaffected, but about becoming more whole, more conscious, more ourselves because of what we've been through. In that light, what does not kill us makes us stronger is not a commandment, but a possibility, a challenge, a truth that invites us to confront life's darker moments, not with despair, but with a kind of defiant creativity. It asks, can you shape meaning out of pain? Can you become deeper rather than bitter? Can you live in such a way that even suffering is not wasted? Nietzsche's own life, marked by solitude, illness, and misunderstood genius, suggests he knew the price of such strength. But he also believed that those who face life honestly, who do not turn away from its difficulties, earn a power that comfort alone can never give. Not invincibility, but depth, clarity, and the quiet knowledge that, having endured, we are no longer who we were, and never again as fragile as before. Man is the measure of all things. With this brief but powerful statement, Protagoras, one of the earliest and most controversial thinkers of ancient Greece, laid the foundation for what we now call relativism. At its core, this phrase suggests that truth is not fixed, objective, or independent of the human experience. Rather, it is shaped by human perception. In full, his statement likely read, "Man is the measure of all things, of things that they are, and of things that are not, that they are not." It was a radical departure from the emerging tradition of natural philosophy, which sought to explain the world in universal, objective terms. For Protagoras, there was no single truth that stood apart from the observer. Each person perceives the world differently, and those perceptions define their reality. In other words, what is true for one may not be true for another, not because someone is wrong, but because truth itself is relative to the individual. This idea, while profound, immediately drew criticism. Plato, in particular, challenged Protagoras fiercely. In his dialogue Theaetetus, Plato portrays Socrates as dissecting the claim, arguing that if all truths are relative, then the statement, "truth is relative," must also be relative, which undermines itself. Furthermore, if one person believes that relativism is false and another believes it is true, both perspectives would have to be equally valid, which leads to a paradox. Yet despite these criticisms, Protagoras' insight cannot be dismissed easily. He was not suggesting that truth is meaningless or that all opinions are equally valuable. Rather, he was drawing attention to the fact that our understanding of the world is inseparable from our sensory and cultural frameworks. What we perceive, what we call reality, is always filtered through our human faculties. Our sense of hot or cold, good or bad, just or unjust. These are not properties of the universe, but of the perceiving mind. In this way, Protagoras anticipated many later developments in philosophy and science. Modern psychology, for example, acknowledges the role of perception and interpretation in shaping human experience. Cognitive science shows that our brains construct the world based on incomplete data, and that our understanding is always, to some extent, a model, never the thing itself. Even in quantum physics, the role of the observer can influence what is observed, at least in the measurement, of certain phenomena. In this sense, Protagoras' idea is less about moral anarchy and more about epistemological humility. It reminds us that no viewpoint is free from perspective. No knowledge is unshaped by context. And yet, this insight raises difficult questions. If all truth is relative, how do we resolve disagreements? If each person is the measure of all things, what becomes of justice, of ethics, of law? Can we still hold others accountable or appeal to something beyond individual preference? These are not easy questions, and Protagoras did not claim to have all the answers, but he offered a lens, a way of seeing, that shifts our attention from the world as it is to the world as we experience it. This shift has enormous implications, especially today. In an age of personalized media, identity politics, and competing narratives of reality, the statement, "Man is the measure of all things," feels uncannily modern. We live in a world where truth is constantly negotiated, where perception often outweighs evidence, and where facts themselves are filtered through personal, emotional, or ideological frames. To take Protagoras seriously is to recognize both the power and the peril of this condition. On one hand, it fosters empathy. By acknowledging that everyone experiences the world differently, we become less quick to judge and more willing to understand. On the other, it demands responsibility. If we are each the measure of our world, then we must also accept the weight of shaping it wisely, not merely according to impulse or bias. Protagoras was a sophist, a teacher of rhetoric and civic virtue. He believed that the art of persuasion, not brute force or divine revelation, was the key to thriving in a democratic society. His relativism was not meant to paralyze us with uncertainty, but to empower us to live thoughtfully, dialogically, and deliberately. He urged us to become aware of our own frameworks, to examine how culture, language, and experience shape what we call true. In this sense, "Man is the measure of all things" is not a final answer, but a beginning. It invites a life of ongoing reflection, communication, and self-awareness. It reminds us that the world is not something we merely observe. It is something we help create through our participation in it. And in that act of creation, we find both freedom and responsibility to measure not only what is, but what could be. Hell is other people. This simple but haunting line from Jean-Paul Sartre's 1944 play No Exit has echoed through decades of philosophical thought and through popular misunderstanding. Many people read it as a declaration of misanthropy. The idea that people are inherently awful, that relationships are toxic, or that human connection is something to be avoided. But Sartre, a leading voice in existentialist philosophy, meant something far more profound and unsettling. In No Exit, three characters, Garcin, Inez, and Estelle, find themselves locked in a mysterious room after death. There are no mirrors, no windows, no escape. They wait, uncertain of what punishment awaits them. Slowly it dawns on them. This room is not a waiting area. It is hell itself. But there are no flames or torturers. The torment comes solely from one another's presence. Each character becomes trapped in the gaze of the others, endlessly judged, exposed, and defined. The mirrors they lack are replaced by the judgments of their companions. When Garcin says, "Hell is other people," he isn't speaking in hatred. He is speaking in realization. Sartre was pointing to a fundamental existential truth. We are never truly alone in our identity. Who we are is shaped not just by our internal self-image, but by how others see us. Identity, in this view, is co-created. We don't merely exist, we exist among, and often through others. This dynamic is captured in Sartre's concept of the look, le regard. When someone looks at you, you cease to be just a subject. You become an object in their world. And once you're aware of that gaze, you begin to adjust. You become self-conscious, performative. You act not only based on who you are, but who you think they see. You internalize their expectations. You try to control their impression. Over time, your sense of self can drift, no longer grounded in your own freedom, but shaped entirely by others' perception. This isn't necessarily evil. Sartre wasn't arguing that people are cruel by nature. But when we surrender completely to the gaze of others, when we let ourselves be defined by them rather than defining ourselves, it becomes a kind of hell. A self that exists only in reflection is a self at risk of disappearing. We experience this every day. The fear before speaking up, the shame of being judged, the awkwardness of not being understood. We adapt based on who is watching. We chase dreams others find impressive. Even our values can shift based on what gains approval. The presence of others, real or imagined, becomes a filter on our every action. Nowhere is this more evident than in the digital world. Social media has made the look inescapable. We construct versions of ourselves, filtered, curated, and optimized for attention. We monitor likes, comments, and engagement. Our lives become performances, shaped by a constant, ambient audience. We are always being seen. The gaze is no longer occasional. It's algorithmic, persistent, and addictive. The boundary between who we are and how we appear becomes paper-thin. But Sartre didn't leave us in despair. At the core of his philosophy is not misery, it is freedom. Existentialism insists that while we are shaped by others, we are not determined by them. We always have the ability to choose, to resist, to define ourselves on our own terms. Sartre's line, properly understood, is not a rejection of others. It's a call to resist becoming a prisoner of their gaze. To escape this hell is not to isolate yourself. It is to reclaim authorship. Sartre famously said, "Existence precedes essence," meaning we are not born with a fixed nature. We must create ourselves, and that creation happens among others, sometimes in harmony, sometimes in conflict, but always with the need for courage and responsibility. Yes, other people can be mirrors, but we are not required to accept every reflection. We are free to respond, to revise, to refuse. Sartre reminds us that while we cannot avoid the gaze, we can choose how to live within it. Authentic existence begins when we stop living as a reflection and start living as the source. Know thyself. These two words, carved into the stone at the entrance to the Temple of Apollo at Delphi, have echoed across thousands of years, from the rituals of ancient Greece to the dialogues of Socrates and into the modern mind. On the surface, the phrase appears simple, even obvious. But as with many great ideas, its simplicity conceals a depth that has shaped entire traditions of philosophy, ethics, and psychology. For the ancient Greeks, know thyself was more than advice. It was a sacred imperative, a call to humility before the divine. At Delphi, visitors sought the wisdom of the oracle, but before they received any answers, they were confronted with a question: do you truly know who you are? Socrates took this idea and placed it at the very heart of his philosophy. He believed that knowledge of the self was the foundation for all other forms of wisdom. If you do not understand your own motivations, desires, fears, and contradictions, how can you claim to understand anything about the world? For Socrates, philosophy was not the memorization of facts, but the examination of the soul, a constant practice of questioning, clarifying, and reflecting. He walked the streets of Athens not to preach answers, but to challenge assumptions, to spark self-awareness in others. To know oneself, for Socrates, was to become aware of one's own ignorance, not in defeat, but in awakening. This is why he famously said, "I know that I know nothing." Because the more deeply you investigate the self, the more you realize its complexity. Your beliefs may not be your own. Your actions may contradict your values. Your identity may be built from expectations rather than truth. And this realization, uncomfortable though it may be, is the beginning of wisdom. Know thyself is not about gazing inward in isolation. It is about engaging the world with a clearer, more honest sense of who you are. It means facing your limits, your potential, your contradictions, and taking responsibility for them. It means understanding how your past shapes your present, how your fears distort your judgment, how your desires drive your decisions. When put this sense, the phrase is both diagnostic and transformative. It uncovers, and then it heals. And though it comes from antiquity, its relevance is only more urgent in our time. We live in an age of externalization, where identity is increasingly defined by appearance, performance, and reaction. Social media, digital avatars, curated personas, these can offer connection, but they can also lead us away from the real, inner self. We are surrounded by noise, by projection, by comparison. And in that noise, the voice of self-knowledge can grow faint, but it has not disappeared. It waits in moments of stillness, in solitude, in doubt, in reflection. To know yourself today is to reclaim sovereignty over your own mind. It is to resist the endless pull of distraction and to ask deeper questions. What do I truly value? What do I fear? What drives me when no one is watching? And what parts of me have I not yet dared to meet? This kind of self-knowledge is not indulgent. It is necessary for maturity, for ethics, for freedom. Because without it, we are more easily manipulated, more reactive, more susceptible to illusion. The examined self is not perfect, but it is grounded. And from that ground, we can build lives that are more honest, more aligned, more resilient. Philosophers throughout history, from Plato to Montaigne, from Descartes to Jung, have returned to this Delphic command. In each era, it has taken new forms, but its essence remains the same. Know who you are, not as others define you, not as you perform, but as you are in your quietest truths. This is not a one-time achievement. It is a lifelong pursuit. We are not static beings. We evolve, and so must our understanding of ourselves. New experiences, new relationships, new failures, all of these change us. And so the work of self-knowledge is never done. It is a practice, a discipline, a way of being, and perhaps this is why the phrase was placed at the entrance to a temple, as a threshold. Before you seek truth, purpose, love, or wisdom, begin here, in yourself. Because without knowing yourself, all other forms of knowledge may be empty, but with it, even the mysteries of the world begin to come into focus. Know thyself is not a command to turn inward forever, but to return to the world more fully human, aware, awake, and alive. We are what we repeatedly do. Excellence, then, is not an act, but a habit. Though this line is often attributed directly to Aristotle, it was in fact a modern summary of his ideas, elegantly phrased by historian Will Durant, while interpreting Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics. Still, the sentiment reflects something deeply Aristotelian, that the essence of who we are is not found in grand, isolated moments, but in the quiet repetition of daily actions. For Aristotle, the good life, eudaimonia, was not about pleasure, power, or fleeting achievements. It was about living in accordance with virtue, developing character through conscious practice over time. He saw human beings not as static entities, but as creatures of potential, shaped by what we choose to do again and again. Just as a sculptor shapes stone into form, we shape ourselves through our habits. Each decision, each repetition, each pattern reinforcing what we become. Excellence, or arete, was not a divine gift or a sudden burst of greatness. It was the outcome of deliberate cultivation, of aligning one's behavior with reason, of choosing the better path often enough that it becomes second nature. In Aristotle's framework, virtues like courage, generosity, and honesty are not innate, traits we either have or lack. They are acquired through action. You become courageous by doing courageous things. You become just by acting justly. Over time, these actions form habits, and those habits become character. This view stands in stark contrast to modern ideas that idolize talent, inspiration, or momentary brilliance. Aristotle's wisdom reminds us that greatness is rarely spontaneous. It is built slowly, intentionally, through discipline, reflection, and consistency. And this insight is deeply empowering. Because if who we are is shaped by what we do repeatedly, then change is always possible. Identity is not fixed. It is formed. Every day becomes an opportunity to reinforce the person we want to become. Every small choice, to practice, to listen, to act with integrity, becomes part of a larger arc. This doesn't mean perfection is required. In fact, Aristotle warned against extremes. Virtue, for him, was always a balance, a mean between deficiency and excess. Courage lies between cowardice and recklessness. Generosity lies between stinginess and wastefulness. The path to excellence is not rigid or uniform. It requires self-awareness, flexibility, and the wisdom to adjust as we go. Yet it is always grounded in habit, in repetition guided by reason. In our time, this teaching resonates across many domains. In personal development, we speak of the power of atomic habits, small, consistent actions that compound over time. In education, we recognize that mastery is built through practice, not instant comprehension. In creativity, we learn that showing up matters more than waiting for inspiration. Aristotle's insight underpins them all, and it reminds us that the extraordinary often grows out of the ordinary, that excellence is not a lightning strike, but a fire we tend daily. But perhaps the most important implication is this: if our habits define us, then we are never passive products of fate or personality. We are co-authors of our becoming. Our routines, our choices, our actions, these are the raw material of character. And so the question becomes, what do I do again and again? What patterns am I reinforcing, whether by intention or neglect? What kind of person am I practicing to be? These are not abstract questions. They are existential ones. Because in the end, our habits do not merely shape what we achieve. They shape what we value, what we pursue, how we relate to others, and how we understand ourselves. They become the rhythm of our days, the texture of our relationships, the structure of our time. Excellence, then, is not distant or rare. It is something within reach, but only through commitment. It is not found in a single act, but in the ongoing, imperfect, courageous work of living intentionally. Aristotle's wisdom invites us to shift our focus from outcomes to processes, from identity as something inherited to something earned, and in doing so, it offers a quiet revolution. The idea that by shaping our habits, we do not just change what we do, we transform who we are. To be is to be perceived. With these 6 words, esse est percipi, George Berkeley challenged one of the deepest assumptions of Western thought, that the world exists independently of our minds. A bishop and philosopher of the early 18th century, Berkeley stood in opposition to the materialism gaining ground in the wake of the scientific revolution. While thinkers like Locke and Newton described a universe made of matter, governed by laws measured by instruments, Berkeley asked a deceptively simple question. If everything we know comes through perception, can we ever truly say that something exists outside of it? When we say a tree exists, we assume it stands there whether we see it or not. But how do we justify that belief? Have we ever known a tree except as a collection of colors, textures, sounds, and smells, all processed through our senses and interpreted by our mind? Strip away perception, Berkeley argued, and we are left with nothing we can point to. The very idea of an unperceived object becomes, to him, incoherent. All of reality, he claimed, is mind-dependent. In his view, the material world does not exist apart from perception. Instead, everything that exists in a mind, either our own or that of another perceiver. For Berkeley, this did not lead to nihilism or solipsism. Rather, it led to the affirmation of a divine perceiver, God, who continuously sustains reality by perceiving all things, even when we do not. That is why the tree continues to exist when no one is looking, because it is always seen by the infinite mind of God. This may sound strange, even mystical to modern ears, but Berkeley's position was not anti-science. It was anti-abstraction. He believed that philosophers had constructed unnecessary layers between us and the world, and that their belief in matter as something separate from experience led only to confusion. If everything we know of the world comes through perception, then why posit a mysterious substance behind it? Why not accept that perception is reality, that being and being perceived are inseparable? Critics, of course, pushed back. Samuel Johnson famously kicked a stone and declared, "I refute it thus." But Berkeley would reply that even the sensation of the stone's resistance, the feeling of hardness, the sound of the kick, is still a perception. The stone's reality lies not in its hidden material substance, but in the vividness and coherence of its appearance. What makes something real is not that it exists beyond experience, but that it is present in experience, shared across minds, ordered and intelligible. In this way, Berkeley's idealism foreshadows many modern debates. Quantum physics, for example, suggests that the act of observation plays a fundamental role in determining the state of particles, a phenomenon that seems to echo Berkeley's claim. In virtual reality, we create immersive worlds that are entirely dependent on perception. In neuroscience, we find that the brain constructs reality from signals, often filling in gaps with assumptions and expectations. Even in AI and consciousness studies, we are forced to ask, what does it mean to perceive, and how does perception relate to existence? Berkeley's answer, though radical, is elegant. Nothing exists outside of perception, because perception is the very condition for being. But this doesn't mean reality is arbitrary. Berkeley emphasized that our perceptions follow regular patterns. The laws of nature are still real, not because matter enforces them, but because the divine mind ensures coherence. In this view, reality is not a mechanical machine, but a living theatre of experience, held together by meaning, not mass. And while his theology may not resonate with all, his central idea remains profoundly challenging. If all we know of the world comes through mind, then the mind is not just a passive receiver, but the very medium through which being is expressed. In the modern world, where many feel alienated, where reality seems abstract and cold, Berkeley's thought offers a surprising warmth. It tells us that we are not ghosts in a machine, we are co-creators in a field of perception. What we call reality is not distant but intimate, woven into awareness itself. And if that is true, then perhaps we bear more responsibility than we realize. The way we attend to the world, the way we perceive others, the way we shape our attention, these are not neutral acts. They are the foundations of existence itself. To perceive with care is to affirm being. To ignore or distort is, in a sense, to erase. Berkeley reminds us that to live consciously is to participate in the ongoing emergence of the world, not just as spectators, but as essential witnesses. To be is to be perceived, and perhaps, just as importantly, to perceive is to allow something to be. Freedom is the recognition of necessity. These words by Hegel sound at first like a contradiction. How can freedom, the very idea of choice, spontaneity, and will, arise from the acknowledgement of necessity, which implies limits, constraints, and inevitability? But for Hegel, one of the most complex and influential philosophers of the 19th century, freedom was never about mere impulse or license. It was not the ability to do anything at any time, nor was it the absence of obstacles. Instead, freedom, in its truest form, was deeply rational, an achievement of consciousness, not instinct. To recognize necessity, for Hegel, means to understand the underlying structure of reality, the laws of nature, the logic of society, the inner workings of thought and spirit. It means coming to terms with the conditions that shape existence, not denying them, but comprehending them fully. In doing so, we stop struggling blindly against the world and begin acting with clarity within it. Just as a musician finds expressive freedom, not by ignoring the rules of music, but by mastering them, the human being finds true freedom, not in ignoring necessity, but in recognizing it and incorporating it into reasoned action. For Hegel, history itself was a story of freedom gradually realizing itself, not through random bursts of rebellion, but through the evolution of self-awareness. Human consciousness, he believed, develops over time, both individually and collectively, coming to see itself more clearly through its interaction with the world. This process, which he called dialectic, involves contradiction, struggle, and synthesis. And at each stage, freedom emerges not as escape from necessity, but as a deeper understanding of it. A child, for example, may see rules as oppression, limits imposed from the outside, but an adult, if wise, sees those same rules not as restrictions, but as structures that make meaningful action possible. The laws of gravity are not a prison. They are the very conditions that allow us to move with purpose. Similarly, in ethics and society, freedom is not the absence of obligation, but the conscious alignment with principles we understand and endorse. When we act without understanding, we are slaves to impulse, to ignorance, to external forces we do not recognize. But when we understand the forces at play, economic, psychological, historical. We can respond, not just react. We can choose, not merely be driven. This is the freedom Hegel speaks of. Not chaotic license, but rational self-determination. His view stands in stark contrast to more individualistic or romantic notions of liberty. In the modern West, freedom is often framed as personal autonomy, the right to do as one pleases. But this version of freedom can be shallow, even self-destructive, if it lacks understanding of the context in which choices are made. Without recognizing necessity, the limits of nature, the structure of society, the needs of others, freedom becomes disconnected from responsibility. Hegel's idea asks more of us. It demands that we look beyond immediate desire and understand the systems we inhabit, that we reflect on what it means to act freely, not in defiance of the world, but in thoughtful engagement with it. This perspective has deep relevance today. In an age of complexity, ecological limits, social systems, algorithms, institutions, our ability to navigate the world freely depends more than ever on understanding how it works. We cannot be free from what we do not understand. To recognize necessity is to cease being surprised by it, to stop mistaking it for injustice or fate. It is to step into the stream of life with eyes open, aware of its currents, capable of directing ourselves within them. Even on a personal level, this idea applies. We often think of freedom as being free from anxiety, from obligation, from struggle. But true freedom may lie not in escaping those experiences, but in understanding where they come from, how they function, and how we relate to them. To recognize necessity is to accept the parts of life we cannot change: death, time, limitation, and to find agency within them. Not all battles can be won, but all choices can be made consciously. That is the space where freedom lives. Hegel believed that history moves toward greater self-consciousness, not inevitably, but potentially. And in that growth, we discover that freedom is not a gift to be granted, but a truth to be realized. It is not given by nature, nor by governments. It arises from thought, from struggle, from the refusal to act blindly. Freedom is the recognition of necessity, reminds us that liberty is not the absence of limits, but the intelligent navigation of them. That the freest among us are not those who deny reality, but those who understand it and act accordingly. Life must be understood backward, but it must be lived forward. In this quiet, poetic sentence, Søren Kierkegaard captures one of the most deeply human paradoxes, that the meaning of our lives often reveals itself only in hindsight, even as we are constantly pushed forward by time, forced to make choices without the benefit of full understanding. Kierkegaard, a 19th century Danish philosopher often regarded as the father of existentialism, was concerned with how individuals experience life, not as abstract ideas, but as real breathing moments filled with uncertainty, anxiety, and decision. He believed that while we crave clarity, life does not offer it in advance. We move through our days without a script, and yet it is only by looking backward, through memory, reflection, and interpretation, that we begin to make sense of what has happened, who we've become, and what it might all mean. Like reading a novel, the events of life often appear random or confusing as we live them. But when viewed in retrospect, we begin to trace patterns, see consequences, and find a kind of logic, sometimes comforting, sometimes tragic. Yet we cannot live backward. We cannot go back and revise. Life insists on moving forward, step by step, decision by decision. And that is the tension Kierkegaard saw at the heart of human existence. That we must act without full knowledge, that we are always in motion toward a future we cannot fully see, while carrying a past we only partially understand. To be human, in this sense, is to live in between. The backward glance gives us meaning, but the forward step demands courage. Kierkegaard's words are not meant to paralyze us, but to illuminate the condition we all share. They invite us to accept that clarity will never come at the moment we most desire it. Often, the decisions that shape us most, whom to love, what to believe, when to leave, what to pursue, are made in fog. Only later do we understand why we made them or what they truly meant. And sometimes, even then, understanding remains incomplete. Yet this is not failure. It is the structure of life itself. In Kierkegaard's view, the leap of faith is not just religious. It is existential. Every action is a leap into the unknown. We must live forward, even as we stumble, even as we doubt, even as we carry with us the burden of memory and regret. And still, through this forward movement, we grow, we become. The backward glance may explain, but the forward motion creates. In the modern world, where we are urged to plan, to optimize, to always have a 5-year vision, Kierkegaard's insight offers a kind of liberation. It reminds us that not everything must be understood right away, that sometimes living authentically means making peace with uncertainty. We can only understand our journey after we've walked part of it. We can only tell the story after the chapters are written. And perhaps most importantly, we must forgive ourselves for not knowing then what we know now. The self is not a static identity. It is a becoming, shaped by time, memory, and experience. And though we may wish to rewrite certain lines, we must live the next ones with intention. Kierkegaard's words suggest that wisdom is not about predicting the future, but about making peace with the past and choosing to continue forward despite its mystery. Reflection, then, becomes not a way of freezing life, but of understanding it more deeply as we go. And while we cannot fully escape the ache of not knowing, we can learn to hold it gently, like a companion on the road ahead. Life must be understood backward, but it must be lived forward. Between these two truths, memory and movement, reflection and risk, we find not an answer, but a rhythm. And in that rhythm, we discover what it means to live. Treat people as ends in themselves, not as means to an end. With this sentence, Immanuel Kant distilled one of the most powerful ethical principles in Western philosophy, a standard not just for moral action, but for moral respect. At the heart of this idea lies the belief that every person possesses intrinsic worth, not because of what they can do, produce, or offer, but simply because they are a rational, autonomous being. This principle is part of Kant's famous categorical imperative, his foundational rule for determining moral action. For Kant, morality is not based on consequences or personal desires, but on duty and universal reason. He argued that we must act according to principles that we could will to become universal laws. And within that framework, he emphasized that human beings should never be used merely as instruments for another's goals. To use someone as a means is to treat them as a tool, something to be manipulated, persuaded, deceived, or controlled for our own advantage. But to treat someone as an end is to recognize their own goals, dignity, and freedom. To see them as a person, not a project, a subject, not a stepping stone. This doesn't mean we can never ask for help, collaborate, or enter into relationships that are mutually beneficial. Kant's point is that we must always recognize the other person's agency. We must not coerce, deceive, exploit, or manipulate, because to do so is to deny them the very thing that makes them human, their ability to choose freely and act according to reason. This principle applies not only in philosophy, but in everyday life, in how we treat friends, employees, strangers, even loved ones. Do we listen to others to truly understand or only to respond? Do we flatter to gain favor or speak honestly, in respect? Do we see people as they are, or as tools to meet our needs, fill our gaps, boost our image? These are not abstract questions. They shape the moral texture of our lives. And in a world increasingly shaped by efficiency, profit, and algorithms, Kant's idea feels more vital than ever. In business, are workers valued for their humanity, or reduced to productivity metrics? In politics, are citizens engaged as thinking participants, or targeted as voters to be won? In relationships, are partners honored for their autonomy, or subtly molded to fit someone else's ideal? Even in technology, we must ask how Kant's ethics apply. As we build systems that imitate human thought and behavior, do we risk forgetting what it means to be human? To be treated not as a utility, but as a being with rights, dignity, and depth. Kant's imperative invites a different kind of attention, one that is slow, careful, and ethical. It asks us to pause before using someone's time, trust, or vulnerability and consider, am I respecting this person's freedom? Am I treating them as a whole, complex end in themselves, or as a shortcut to my own satisfaction? To live this principle is not always easy. It may require turning down opportunities, speaking difficult truths, or sacrificing short-term gain. But Kant believed that such a life is not only moral, it is dignified. It reflects the kind of respect we would want for ourselves and the kind of world we would hope to build. To treat people as ends is to accept that everyone carries their own universe of thoughts, values, dreams, and fears, and that each of these deserves regard, not just recognition. It is to move through life not extracting value from others, but participating in mutual respect, shared responsibility, and a deeper sense of justice. In the end, this principle is a mirror. It reflects not only how we see others, but how we understand ourselves as beings not defined by function or achievement, but by the capacity to think, choose, and act with integrity. Treat people as ends in themselves, not as means to an end, is more than a moral rule. It is a call to see the sacred in the ordinary, to meet every person, in every moment, with the quiet knowledge that their life matters just as much as our own. Act only according to that maxim whereby you can at the same time will that it should become a universal law. This sentence, the first and most famous formulation of Immanuel Kant's categorical imperative, offers a radically rational foundation for morality. Kant's aim wasn't to provide a rulebook for every situation, but to offer a method, a way to determine whether an action is ethical by testing the principle behind it. A maxim, in Kant's philosophy, is the reason or intention behind your action, the rule you give yourself when you choose to do something. Kant argues that to act morally is to ask, what if everyone acted this way, in the same situation, for the same reason? Could I will this maxim as a universal law for all rational beings? If the answer is yes, and doing so leads to no contradiction, then the action is morally valid. If not, it is unethical, regardless of its consequences. Kant's approach is not based on outcomes. He rejected consequentialist theories like utilitarianism, which judge morality by results, maximizing happiness or minimizing harm. For Kant, this creates instability. It allows for exceptions, moral shortcuts, and the justification of harm when it suits our goals. Instead, he sought a system grounded in reason, consistent, impartial, and universal. Kant believed rational beings, by virtue of their capacity for thought, can recognize moral duties. True freedom, he argued, does not mean doing whatever we want. It means choosing to act according to reason, even when it conflicts with our desires. Consider lying to avoid trouble. Could you will that lying be a universal law? Could everyone lie when it benefits them? Kant says no. If lying became universal, trust would break down, and the very concept of truth would lose meaning. Lying relies on others being honest. It cannot logically be a universal practice. This contradiction shows the action is immoral. The categorical imperative is demanding. It doesn't excuse harmful actions based on good intentions. It doesn't accept exceptions just because something feels right or works out. Instead, it insists that every person be treated as a rational being worthy of respect, and that every action be judged by whether it could become a law for all. This puts immense moral responsibility on the individual. It means we cannot say, no one will know, or just this once, or everyone else does it, and still claim to be acting ethically. Kant's framework requires integrity, the courage to measure private choices against a universal standard, and to act as if you were setting a moral example for humanity. But this is also what makes Kant's philosophy deeply empowering. It treats People not as passive followers of rules, but as active moral agents. Through reason, we can discover moral truths, not handed down by culture or religion, but grounded in logic and human dignity. This universalizability is what separates ethical principles from mere convenience. It allows us to question injustice, not just emotionally, but rationally. Though Kant's theory is abstract, it applies to real-life questions. Should I cheat on an exam to get ahead? Should I evade taxes if I won't get caught? Should I break a promise if it no longer benefits me? Kant's method forces us to look beyond the moment and ask, what if everyone did this? Could the world still function? If the answer is no, if the action destroys the very conditions it depends on, then it fails the test. The categorical imperative also affirms the dignity of others. To act only on maxims you can will as universal means treating people not as tools, but as ends in themselves, rational beings who are equally bound by and protected by moral law. This is where ethics becomes justice. To lie or exploit is to make yourself an exception, something the moral law cannot allow. Such actions are unjust because they violate the mutual respect morality requires. In this way, Kant lays a philosophical foundation for human rights, fairness, and modern legal principles. While his ideas may seem rigid, they are grounded in a belief that people can rise above instinct and impulse. For Kant, reason is what makes us human, and what makes us free. To follow the categorical imperative is not to obey blindly, but to commit to reasoned, principled living. It asks more than emotion. It demands thought. It offers no shortcuts, but instead a method, one that, when applied sincerely, helps align our choices with justice, humanity, and a shared moral world. It is a path not of ease, but of clarity and moral depth, one that honors the reason within us all. All men by nature desire to know. With this opening line of metaphysics, Aristotle sets the tone not just for a book, but for an entire philosophical tradition. He begins not with a complex theory, but with an observation so simple and universal that it needs no defense. Human beings are driven by curiosity. From the moment we open our eyes, we begin to seek, to look, to listen, to explore, to understand. Infants stare at faces. Children ask endless questions. Adults turn to books, art, science, conversation, and reflection, not merely for utility, but for meaning. For Aristotle, this desire to know is not an accident or a luxury. It is part of our nature. It distinguishes us from other animals. While other creatures act according to instinct, we ask why. We wonder not only how things work, but what they mean. And from this desire comes all human progress: philosophy, science, ethics, politics, and art. But for Aristotle, knowing is not merely the accumulation of facts, it is the pursuit of understanding, the grasping of causes, principles, and purposes. True knowledge is not passive reception, but active inquiry. It is the journey from sensation to memory, from memory to experience, from experience to reasoning. He describes this process as a kind of ascent, from the particulars of everyday life to the universals that give them meaning. At the highest level, philosophy itself becomes the purest expression of this desire to know, not because it serves a practical goal, but because it seeks truth for its own sake. Yet Aristotle was also practical. He recognized that human life is lived not only in thought, but in action. Knowledge must be connected to life, to ethics, to politics, to how we live with others. The desire to know is noble, but it must be directed wisely. Knowledge without virtue can become manipulation. Intelligence without understanding can lead to arrogance. And yet, when rightly cultivated, the desire to know becomes one of the deepest sources of freedom. It allows us to transcend the immediate, to step back from custom and habit, and to ask what is true, not just what is familiar. In the modern age, this desire is both amplified and challenged. We are surrounded by information, by data, headlines, content, and noise. We have access to more facts than any generation before us. But information is not the same as knowledge, and knowledge is not the same as wisdom. Aristotle reminds us that the hunger for understanding must be nurtured, not drowned. It requires patience, discipline, and care. It grows not from speed, but from depth. And in a world that often values answers more than questions, his insight becomes a quiet rebellion, an invitation to return to wonder. He believed that philosophy begins in wonder, thalmazein, that sense of amazement and awe that drives us to look beyond appearances and into the nature of things. And this wonder, far from being childish, is the beginning of maturity. To desire to know is to admit that we do not already know. It is to be humble before the vastness of the unknown. But it is also to be courageous, to move forward into that unknown, trusting that understanding is possible, that the world is intelligible, and that our minds are capable of grasping it, even if only in part. All men by nature desire to know is more than a philosophical observation. It is a recognition of something sacred within us. The restless spark that seeks meaning, that asks why, that never quite settles for surface. And it is a reminder that in seeking knowledge, we are not just acquiring facts, we are fulfilling a part of our deepest nature. In every question we ask, in every attempt to understand, whether through science, philosophy, art, or simple reflection, we become more fully ourselves. We enact the very thing that makes us human. And perhaps, in that search, we find not only knowledge, but wisdom, connection, and a deeper sense of belonging in the world. Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. These words, written by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. in 1963 from a jail cell in Birmingham, Alabama, are more than a condemnation of discrimination. They are a moral compass, a warning, and a call to conscience. At the time, King had been arrested for leading a peaceful protest against racial segregation. Critics, including white clergy, urged him to wait, to be patient, to allow justice to unfold gradually. His response, composed under confinement, was both passionate and profoundly philosophical. He explained that waiting was not a neutral act, and that the silence of the moderate was often more dangerous than the actions of the extremist. But above all, he made clear that injustice, even in a single town or policy, does not remain isolated. It spreads. It corrodes the idea of fairness at its root. Because justice is not a local issue. It is a principle that binds people and places together. In this light, King's statement is not simply political. It is existential. It reveals how deeply human lives are interconnected. When one person's rights are violated, the integrity of rights everywhere is compromised. When a community is denied dignity, the shared moral foundation of all communities is shaken. Justice, in King's view, is not a wall that protects individuals. In isolation, it is a fabric, and every injustice is a tear in that fabric, one that weakens the whole. This idea reaches far beyond the civil rights movement. It challenges the comfortable notion that we can remain detached from the suffering of others, that we can isolate our peace from someone else's pain. Whether it is poverty across borders, censorship in distant nations, or discrimination in our own neighborhoods, King reminds us that moral distance does not excuse moral responsibility. To tolerate injustice in one place is to normalize it everywhere, even if quietly, even if unintentionally. And so his quote asks not just for empathy, but for awareness, for vigilance, for the courage to recognize that neutrality can be complicity. In modern times, this idea is just as necessary. In a world shaped by globalization, technology, and social interdependence, the ripples of injustice move faster and further than ever before. A violation of rights in one country can inspire repression elsewhere, or resistance. Economic inequality in one region can create waves of migration, resentment, instability. Environmental exploitation in one ecosystem can disrupt life across continents. Injustice is never still. It is a force. And as such, it must be met not with delay, but with moral urgency. King's words also reflect a profound belief in shared dignity. That every person, regardless of geography, identity, or circumstance is worthy of respect, of voice, of safety, and that to uphold justice is not merely to protect laws, but to protect people. He spoke not just of civil disobedience, but of higher obedience, to a moral law that transcends unjust rules. For him, nonviolent resistance was not weakness, it was the refusal to accept injustice as fate. Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere also speaks to the temptation of selective outrage. It challenges us to care not only when our group is affected or our ideology is confirmed, but whenever human dignity is denied, even if it's uncomfortable, even if it costs us something. True justice, King believed, is not partisan. It is not tribal. It is rooted in the shared human condition. And so this quote is not only a warning, it is a mirror. It asks each of us, where am I silent? What injustice have I learned to ignore? What distant suffering have I mistaken for irrelevance? In asking these questions, we do not become overwhelmed. We become awake. Because the greatest threat to justice is not always evil. Sometimes it is indifference. And King's legacy is a reminder that silence is a position, that comfort can be dangerous, and that a truly just world is one in which no one is left unseen, unheard, or unprotected, no matter how far away their struggle may seem. You can discover more about a person in an hour of play than in a year of conversation. With this deceptively simple observation, Plato, one of the foundational figures in Western philosophy, offers a profound insight into human nature. It is easy to assume that speech is the truest window into the soul. After all, we define ourselves by language, tell stories to explain who we are, and use conversation as the primary way to connect. But Plato, through his dialogues and especially in his reflections on education and character, recognized that words can be rehearsed, guarded, filtered. In conversation, people can craft personas, recite beliefs, and present curated versions of themselves. But in moments of play, when the stakes are low and spontaneity rises, the mask often slips. Play, in its essence, is unstructured, expressive, and often unconscious. Whether it's through a game, a creative task, a friendly competition, or shared humor, play reveals how a person responds to challenge, how they handle loss or success, how they treat others when they don't have to. In play, we see instinct, emotion, reaction, the self unpolished. Plato understood this not only in children, for whom play was a key tool of learning and moral formation, but in adults, who often reveal their character most clearly when they believe no one is watching too closely. In the Republic, Plato speaks of the tripartite soul, reason, spirit, and appetite, and suggests that true harmony comes when these parts are balanced. Play often exposes this balance or imbalance. Does a person play to dominate, to impress, to connect, to escape? Do they share joy or hoard victory? Do they become generous or cruel when no consequence follows? These subtle patterns reveal more than 1,000 careful words ever could. In modern times, this insight remains powerfully relevant. We often meet others through conversation, interviews, meetings, dates, where everyone is polished, intentional, prepared. But watch someone in a moment of play, in a team sport, a board game, a shared laugh, or a digital simulation. You'll learn how they deal with pressure, with failure, with ego. You'll see competitiveness, patience, empathy, insecurity, not because they announce it, but because it shows. Even in childhood, psychologists know that observing a child at play can reveal their inner world, their fears, their values, their problem-solving style. And in adulthood, the rare moments when we let ourselves play, freely and sincerely, can expose who we've become and how close or far we are from our unguarded self. Plato's statement also serves as a gentle warning, not to judge people solely by what they say, but to pay attention to what they do when nothing forces their hand. Because play is not frivolous, it is formative. It reveals ethics in motion, spirit in action. And in a world obsessed with productivity and polish, play remains one of the last places where the truth of personality can emerge unscripted. But more than a tool of observation, this quote is also an invitation. To allow play back into our own lives, not as escape, but as expression. To notice how we act when the roles are dropped and the goals are unclear. To see who we are when we are not performing. Because in play, we find not only the character of others, we rediscover our own. The joy, the competitiveness, the gentleness or aggression, all speak clearly and without pretense. And perhaps this is why in 1 hour of genuine play, a deeper connection can form than through a year of cautious speech. It is not that conversation is false, but that it is filtered. Play is immediate. And in that immediacy, we glimpse what Plato always sought, not just what people say they are, but what their souls actually reveal. He who opens a school door closes a prison. With this quiet yet profound sentence, Victor Hugo, the 19th century novelist, statesman, and moral visionary, draws a direct line between education and freedom, between ignorance and confinement. It is a statement not just about learning, but about justice. Hugo, who spent his life defending the poor and forgotten, understood that the walls of a prison are often built long before a cell is locked. They rise in neglected neighborhoods, underfunded schools, and broken systems. But education, not just the delivery of facts, but the cultivation of dignity, curiosity, and critical thought, interrupts that cycle. To open a school door, in Hugo's view, is to prevent someone from ever being defined by chains or confinement. It's a refusal to accept failure as someone's fate. It says, you matter. You are not disposable. In 19th century France, Hugo witnessed a society where poverty was criminalized and ignorance punished more than wrongdoing. To him, a school was hope, a place where life could be changed not by force, but through understanding, not by judgment, but through perspective. His words reflect a deeper truth. Incarceration isn't random. It grows from social conditions, from what's denied, from who's overlooked. Where opportunity is absent, other systems step in. While laws address symptoms, education addresses cause. To open a school is to intervene early. It's not just knowledge, it's identity. When someone learns to read, they don't just gain literacy, they gain voice, a way to interpret the world, a way to question it. That voice becomes protection. A person who can think is harder to manipulate. A person who knows their rights is harder to silence. A person who has been seen is less likely to vanish. When a society invests in schools, teachers, and learning environments, it's choosing not only education, but a future that uplifts instead of punishes. Hugo's wisdom remains urgent. In many countries, the connection between failing schools and growing prison systems is not symbolic, it's statistical. There's even a term for it, the school-to-prison pipeline, a structure where disciplinary policies, low funding, and institutional neglect push vulnerable children, especially from marginalized groups, out of classrooms and into the justice system. And still, for every dollar spent on incarceration, how many are withheld from education? How many futures are lost because the door to a school never opened wide enough, long enough, or early enough? Hugo's quote is a challenge. It tells us that every investment in learning is a form of prevention, that a teacher, a book, or one encouraging moment can do more to prevent crime than any fence or cell. But education must be more than curriculum. It must be human. It must see the whole person. To open a school door is to say, you belong, you are seen. Hugo, whose novels gave voice to convicts, the poor and the outcast, understood something critical. Change doesn't begin with punishment, it begins with recognition. To be seen through learning is to be changed by hope. Education offers order where there was chaos, thought where there were commands, vision where there was only survival. And when that happens, the prison begins to loosen its grip. Not because it's dismantled, but because it's made unnecessary. Because lives stop following the script that leads there. They are rerouted, early, gently, wisely, toward contribution. Today, Hugo's insight echoes through every call for educational reform. We hear it in demands for equity, early childhood access, culturally inclusive teaching, and trauma-informed classrooms. These aren't luxuries. They're the ethical foundation of a just society. To open a school is to choose prevention over punishment. And when we fail to choose that, when we let ignorance take root where understanding might have bloomed, we help build the very future we claim to fear. Hugo reminds us that future isn't fixed. It's shaped by the doors we open or fail to. His quote may be brief, but its vision is vast. It is a blueprint for peace. If we want fewer prisons, we need more classrooms. If we want less violence, we need more books. If we want lasting justice, we must begin not at the courtroom, but at the blackboard. A society that builds schools is not only smarter, it is safer, freer, and more humane. Because real justice isn't only about what happens after the law is broken, it's about what happens before. It's in the moments when a life could still be written differently. He who opens a school door closes a prison. With these words, Victor Hugo offers more than a quote. He offers a vision, a future where doors open not only to buildings, but to possibility. And every time we choose education, we take one step away from fear and one step closer to freedom. The mind is furnished with ideas by experience alone. With this simple yet revolutionary claim, John Locke, the 17th century English philosopher, laid the cornerstone of modern empiricism. In a world still shaped by the belief in innate ideas and divine imprints upon the soul, Locke proposed something radical, that the mind at birth is a tabula rasa, a blank slate. It does not arrive preloaded with truths about math, morality, or even God. Instead, everything we know, every idea, belief, concept, and principle must come through experience. It is through sensation, what we see, hear, touch, taste, and smell, and reflection, the mind's awareness of its own processes, that consciousness begins to take form. For Locke, this wasn't just a learning theory, it was a reimagining of what it means to be human. If the mind starts empty, then knowledge is earned, not inherited. It becomes a possibility for all, not a privilege for a few. The child of a farmer and the child of a philosopher begin the same way, shaped not by fate, but by experience, education, and exposure. Locke's philosophy placed experience, not tradition or authority, at the heart of knowledge. With that shift, he helped spark the Enlightenment, the rise of scientific thinking, and the birth of liberal democracy. For him, ideas did not descend from the heavens. They accumulated like droplets in a jar. Simple ideas, red, hot, round, enter first through the senses. These are then combined and abstracted into complex ideas. Beauty, justice, selfhood. Even our sense of self, Locke argued, arises from memory. From a stream of experiences the mind remembers and claims. This view made education not just important, but essential. If experience forms the mind, then the quality and variety of those experiences shape who we become. The language we hear, the books we read, the role models we follow, all contribute, either clarity or confusion. To Locke, ignorance was not sin. It was lack of input, and error was not evil. It was a natural result of learning with imperfect data. This deeply human idea shaped some of his most influential political beliefs, that people are capable of reason, that they can govern themselves, that knowledge should come from reflection, not force. Locke made epistemology inseparable from ethics and politics. If our minds are shaped by experience, then every person has the right to think freely, to doubt, to question, to seek their own understanding. No one should be compelled to accept truths they haven't examined, and no one's ideas should be dismissed without acknowledging the path that shaped them. The mind is furnished with ideas by experience alone is more than a theory of knowledge. It is a philosophy of respect. It recognizes that our minds are not born divine or fixed, but are crafted through what we've lived. And if we want to change someone's beliefs, we must speak to their experience, not shame it. Today, Locke's insight continues to echo through neuroscience, psychology, and education. We now know the brain is physically shaped by early experiences, by language, attention, trauma, repetition. We know that what's heard, felt, and seen in youth lays the foundation for cognition, emotion, and belief. Every worldview, no matter how strange or sophisticated, starts with what the mind has encountered. But Locke's theory faces modern complications. In the digital age, experience is often filtered, curated by screens, shaped by algorithms. The furniture of our minds is now arranged by tech companies, media platforms, and recommendation engines. This raises questions Locke never imagined. If experience shapes thought, who shapes experience? Who decides what children see, what minds hear, what becomes familiar, what becomes invisible? Still, Locke's vision offers a compass. It reminds us that knowledge is a journey, not a possession. That belief is not black and white, but a gradient of exposure. That truth comes not from force, but from honest, sustained engagement with the world, and that every moment, every conversation, every observation, all furnish the mind. The mind is not a sealed vault. It is a living archive, one filled over time by what it senses, reflects on, and remembers. The mind is furnished with ideas by experience alone is not just a claim. It is an invitation to learn not passively, but curiously, to seek unfamiliar experiences, to examine beliefs, not to discard them, but to understand their roots. Locke's philosophy asks us to take responsibility for our minds, to shape them with care, with openness, and with humility. Every thought has a source, every soul has a story, and each of those stories is written, line by line, in the language of experience. He who thinks great thoughts often makes great errors. With this quiet warning, Martin Heidegger, one of the most influential and controversial philosophers of the 20th century, reminds us that the pursuit of deep ideas is not without danger. In fact, the very act of thinking boldly, of questioning foundations, of reaching beyond conventional boundaries, often brings with it a unique kind of risk, the risk of being profoundly wrong. Great thoughts demand courage. They require us to stand at the edge of understanding, to step outside of what is certain and familiar, and to attempt to see the world in a new way. This is what all original thinkers do, from philosophers and scientists to artists and reformers. They resist simplification. They challenge dogma. They ask questions others have not dared to ask. But this same daring that leads to brilliance can also lead to blindness. When we move into uncharted intellectual territory, we leave behind the guardrails of common sense and accepted truth. We are forced to rely on intuition, reason, and vision, tools that, while powerful, are never perfect. And in this space of possibility, errors can grow large because their roots lie deep. To think greatly is to imagine systems, frameworks, ideals, but the greater the structure, the more devastating its collapse can be if built on a flawed premise. This is not a condemnation of deep thought. It is a recognition of its weight. Heidegger himself knew this truth intimately. His philosophical work, particularly Being and Time, reshaped how generations of thinkers approach the nature of existence, time, and human consciousness. He brought language to the forefront of philosophical inquiry, revealing how our understanding of the world is shaped not only by reason, but by the words and meanings we inherit. Yet Heidegger also made one of the most tragic errors a great thinker can make. He aligned himself, at least for a time, with the Nazi regime. He believed, mistakenly and catastrophically, that a spiritual renewal of the German people could be found through nationalism and authoritarianism. His philosophical vision of being was, at moments, distorted by a political blindness that cost him dearly and cast a long shadow over his legacy. His life illustrates his own warning. Thinking greatly does not guarantee acting wisely, and the more powerful one's ideas, the greater the moral burden to examine them carefully, to question not just their internal logic, but their human consequences. This dynamic is not unique to Heidegger. History is filled with examples of visionary individuals whose ideas changed the world, but not always for the better. The same mind that conceives of revolutionary art or science can also build dangerous ideologies. The more confident we become in the beauty of our thoughts, the more tempted we may be to overlook their flaws or dismiss their critics. But this, quote, reminds us that no thought is beyond scrutiny, and that intellectual ambition must be paired with humility. Great errors often come not from ignorance but from overreach, from the belief that we have seen further than all others, from the seduction of having something entirely new to offer. But wisdom lies not only in thinking deeply, but in thinking ethically, in remembering that ideas have effects, that abstractions touch lives, that the mind is not separated from the world it imagines. In a way, Heidegger's quote is not just a commentary on philosophy. It is a commentary on the human condition. To reach for greatness is to open the door to failure. To risk brilliance is also to risk harm. But the answer is not to retreat from thought. It is to think with awareness, to think with others, to think with care. In our time, where new technologies emerge faster than ethics can catch up, and where bold claims travel farther than careful ones, Heidegger's warning is urgent. As we design systems that affect billions, as we challenge norms and rewrite rules, we must remember, the more powerful the thought, the greater its impact, and the deeper our responsibility to examine it. This doesn't mean silencing innovation. It means anchoring it. It means asking not only, is this original, or is this brilliant, but also, is this just? Is this grounded? What might go wrong? Because sometimes the greatest errors wear the mask of insight, and sometimes the most dangerous ideas are born not from hatred, but from abstraction, from forgetting the reality that lives beneath the theory. He who thinks great thoughts often makes great errors. In this line, there is no cynicism, only gravity. A reminder that to be a thinker is not to escape the world, but to be deeply accountable to it. And that every idea we shape in turn begins to shape us, and the world we all must live in. Liberty consists in doing what one desires. With this bold but nuanced statement, John Stuart Mill, one of the leading thinkers of 19th century liberalism, presents a vision of human freedom that feels both empowering and provocative. In a world long constrained by authority, tradition, and conformity, the notion that liberty lies in acting on one's own desires can seem like a breath of clarity, a declaration of personal sovereignty. But Mill's understanding is far more layered than a call for impulsive freedom. He is not promoting chaos or unchecked individualism. Rather, he defines liberty as the right to pursue one's own good in one's own way, so long as it does not harm others. This idea is central to his harm principle, the cornerstone of On Liberty, that the only justification for interfering with someone's freedom is to prevent harm to others, not to shield them from themselves, not to enforce moral codes, and not to satisfy the discomfort of the majority. For Mill, a truly free society is one where people are allowed to think, speak, and live according to their own convictions, even when those convictions are eccentric, unpopular, or challenging to cultural norms. True liberty, he believed, makes space for dissent, experimentation, and non-conformity, because it is through the clash of perspectives, the testing of ideas, and the variety of lifestyles that truth can emerge and individuality can thrive. But Mill's concept of desire is not hedonistic. He doesn't equate liberty with impulse or momentary whim. He believes that human beings, when educated and given time to reflect, desire more than pleasure. They desire purpose, depth, and growth. The desire he refers to is one born from awareness, from a reflective sense of what is good for the self and just toward others. He also feared what he called the tyranny of the majority, not just the legal power of the state, but the social pressures that shame, exclude, and crush difference. Conformity, he argued, can be just as oppressive as law. A free society must therefore protect liberty, not just from kings, but from crowds. So when Mill says, liberty consists in doing what one desires, he is also saying this. It is not the role of the state, the church, or the culture to dictate your life's path. That decision is yours. You have the right to choose your work, your beliefs, your love, your direction, even if it disturbs tradition or appears to others as failure. Because the suppression of that liberty stifles not just individuals, but society itself. A culture that silences difference, silences discovery. And without liberty, humanity stops evolving. Still, Mill acknowledges that freedom is not simple. Desire can mislead. Freedom, if detached from responsibility, can turn into selfishness, excess, or even cruelty. That's why he insists on limits, not moralistic ones, but rational ones. Your liberty ends where another's safety begins. You are free to speak, but not to incite violence. Free to live unconventionally, but not to exploit. Free to seek joy, but not by violating someone else's dignity. This careful balance between liberty and non-harm gives Mill's philosophy its lasting strength. In a time when freedom is often polarized, either tightly controlled or dangerously unrestrained, Mill offers a principled middle path, radical respect for the individual, paired with an equally radical duty to avoid harm. In today's digital world, his ideas remain as vital as ever. When billions can express themselves online, how do we navigate the line between liberty and harm? When personal choices impact public health or the stability of democracy, how do we preserve freedom without sacrificing collective responsibility? Mill's answer is not to restrict liberty, but to elevate it, to foster education, public discourse, and moral reasoning so that people learn to desire wisely. Because in his view, a free society is not merely a legal structure, it is a moral culture, one in which people are trusted to shape their lives with thoughtfulness, and in which law exists not to control, but to protect that trust. Liberty consists in doing what one desires, is therefore not a blank check. It is a principle. It honors the dignity of the human will. It affirms the idea that people, when free to think and act, can create lives of meaning and value, not because they are compelled to, but because they choose to. And in that choice, made freely and with care, liberty becomes not just a right, but a kind of beauty, a life lived with agency, difference, and shared responsibility. It is not length of life, but depth of life. In this simple and radiant sentence, Ralph Waldo Emerson, the 19th century American essayist, philosopher, and transcendentalist, offers a quiet but profound redefinition of what it means to live meaningfully in a world increasingly focused on how long we live, on prolonging youth, extending lifespans, delaying death. Emerson redirects our attention inward, toward the quality, intensity, and fullness of the life we are already living. He reminds us that it is possible to stretch time without truly inhabiting it, that days and years can pass like scenery behind glass if we are not present within them. For Emerson, depth meant something more than happiness or success. It meant authenticity, a life lived consciously, intentionally, in alignment with the inner self. It meant feeling things fully, asking real questions, standing in awe of nature, being awake to the invisible currents that move through experience. A deep life, to Emerson, was not necessarily dramatic or loud. It could be still, it could be quiet, but it would never be shallow. He believed in the soul, not as a religious abstraction, but as the part of us that seeks truth, that resonates with beauty, that recognizes justice. And to live deeply is to listen to that soul, to follow its contours even when the world encourages distraction. In this way, the quote becomes a kind of compass. It points not toward how many pages are in the book, but how much is written on each one. Emerson's philosophy was rooted in the idea that each person holds a unique, divine spark, a truth that cannot be copied, only expressed. And so depth is personal. It is the courage to be oneself when conformity whispers otherwise. It is the willingness to confront suffering rather than escape it, to learn from pain rather than run from it, to love without guarantees, and to fail without losing faith in life's value. A long life filled with avoidance is not, in Emerson's eyes, a full life. A short life lived with presence, conviction, and wonder. That is where real greatness lies. This view stands in contrast to much of modern culture, where longevity is often confused with legacy and productivity with purpose. We measure lives by milestones, years worked, achievements collected, time survived. But Emerson offers a different metric, one invisible to clocks and calendars. He asks, were you awake to your own existence? Did you listen to what mattered? Did you speak the truth when it was hard? Pause long enough to hear the wind through the trees. Look someone in the eye and really see them. That is depth. And depth is not cumulative. It is immediate. It is not something we build over time, but something we enter now, in this moment. A single conversation can be deeper than a decade of silence. A single act of forgiveness can transform a life more than 1,000 resentful days. A moment of awe, of clarity, of surrender. These cannot be scheduled, but when they arrive, they expand time from the inside. Emerson's words also carry a kind of freedom. They release us from the pressure to extend life endlessly, as if mortality were a failure. They remind us that what matters most is not whether we live to be 40 or 90, but whether we lived truly. They encourage us to live now. Not someday, not after retirement, not when everything is perfect, but now, with full attention, with deliberate care, with a heart open to both joy and sorrow. Depth, after all, is not the absence of pain. It is the presence of meaning within it. It is what allows us to suffer without becoming bitter, to grieve without forgetting how to love, to age without becoming numb. To live deeply is to live with eyes wide open, even when it hurts, especially when it hurts. Emerson's view is spiritual, but not in a dogmatic sense. It is rooted in the natural world, in the poetry of leaves and rivers, in the individual mind as a source of truth. He believed that to live with depth was to live in dialogue with nature, with conscience, with the quiet voice inside that knows what really matters. And in a world of noise, that kind of life takes courage. It takes choosing meaning over motion, silence over distraction, sincerity over performance. It is not length of life, but depth of life is more than a quote. It is an invitation. It invites us to return to what is real, to ask not how long we've lived, but how fully, to measure our days not by what we earned or proved, but by what we felt, who we touched, what we learned, and how much of ourselves we gave. It tells us that life's value cannot be extended, only deepened. And in that depth, we may find something richer than longevity. We may find presence, truth, and the quiet joy of having really lived. Even while they teach, men learn. With these few words, Seneca, Roman statesman, playwright, and Stoic philosopher, captures one of the most quietly powerful truths of growth, that teaching is not the endpoint of knowledge, but part of its deepening. It is not the final step after mastery, but a continuation of the learning process itself. In modern terms, we often imagine the teacher as the one who knows, and the student as the one who doesn't. But Seneca flips that hierarchy. He suggests that teaching is not a display of expertise. It is a mirror, a dialogue, a challenge. The act of explaining a concept forces us to test how clearly we understand it. It exposes gaps in logic, demands precision, and invites reflection. In striving to communicate an idea with clarity, we often gain a clearer understanding of it ourselves. Seneca's insight is thoroughly Stoic. In Stoicism, learning is not only intellectual, it is ethical and continuous. A true philosopher is not someone who delivers truth from on high, but someone who struggles daily with their own limitations. To teach, in this view, is not to preach, but to practice. It is to repeat what must be remembered, to embody what one hopes to pass on. Seneca's own writings, especially his letters, often served as lessons to others and reminders to himself. Teaching, for him, was a form of self-discipline, a tool for internal transformation. So when he writes, "Even while they teach, men learn," he is also confessing, No one is ever finished learning. And passing on knowledge may be one of the most effective ways to truly absorb it. This idea resonates far beyond philosophy. In classrooms, the best educators are not those who assert complete authority, but those who remain open to discovery, who admit what they don't know, who grow alongside their students. In leadership, the most effective mentors are those who evolve through the process of guiding others. In parenting, we find ourselves transformed as we teach a child to speak, to reason, to live. Even in everyday conversation, we feel the shift. Speaking an idea aloud often reshapes how we think about it. Great thinkers, scientists, and artists often say they only fully understood their work after trying to explain it to someone else. Teaching externalizes thought. It forces us to move from intuition to articulation, from vague understanding to structured clarity. And in doing so, it humbles us, because the moment we try to explain something, we meet the edge of our knowledge. That's why teaching is not a performance of superiority, but an act of shared elevation. It assumes that teacher and student are both walking the path of understanding, just at different places along it. Seneca's wisdom also challenges the fear-driven idea that we must wait until we are qualified to teach. We often hold back from sharing what we know out of insecurity, feeling unprepared, unpolished, incomplete. But this quote reminds us, teaching is not the reward for knowing. It is part of the path. It is the method. You don't need to be a master to be a mentor. You only need to be willing to learn out loud. Teaching holds us accountable. It keeps our knowledge alive, evolving, and relevant. It deepens our empathy, because in helping others understand, we learn to see through their eyes, to hear their confusion, to meet them where they are. Teaching sharpens not only what we know, but how we relate. It is also a profound exercise in humility. The title of teacher is not a badge of finality. It is an invitation to continual learning. Especially in today's world, where knowledge evolves rapidly and new truths are always emerging, the best teachers are those who remain students, willing to revise, to question, to grow. Even while they teach, men learn is also deeply hopeful. It reminds us that knowledge is not depleted when shared. It is expanded. That the act of teaching is not the closure of a thought, but the opening of a new one. Wisdom is not lost in translation. It is born there. Every time we try to help someone understand, we are reshaping our own mind in the process. In the Stoic view, wisdom is not something you hold. It is something you live. And teaching is one of the most transformative ways to live it. Because to teach is to rehearse what matters, to test your understanding, to walk your talk. So the next time you explain something, offer guidance, mentor a friend, or simply clarify your thoughts out loud, remember, you're not just passing on knowledge, you're building it. Teaching is not proof that you've arrived. It is proof that you're still becoming. And that may be why the greatest teachers are always the most teachable. Not because they know everything, but because they never stop learning. The life of man is solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. With this bleak and unforgettable phrase, Thomas Hobbes, writing in the 17th century amid England's civil war, delivered one of the starkest portraits of the human condition ever penned. In Leviathan, his great political work, Hobbes asked what life would be like without government, law, or shared agreements to keep our worst instincts in check, what he called the state of nature. And what he saw was not freedom, but fear. Not noble savages in harmony with the earth, but desperate individuals locked in a daily fight to survive. In this condition, Hobbes wrote, there is no place for industry, no culture, no navigation, no society. There is only the raw will to survive, and the constant threat that someone stronger, quicker, or more ruthless might kill you to preserve themselves. Without common power, there are no rights. Without shared law, no justice. There is only the war of all against all, where every other person is, at least potentially, your enemy. Hobbes wasn't trying to flatter human nature. He was building a case for government, for why people must surrender certain freedoms to enjoy any freedom at all. In his view, the natural state of mankind is not peace, but conflict, not reasoned cooperation, but mutual suspicion and self-interest. Every person is a potential threat because without rules, there are no limits. When resources are scarce and safety uncertain, the only law is survival. And so, to escape this brutal condition, Hobbes imagined a social contract, not a written document, but an implicit agreement to give up some natural freedoms, like the right to steal or strike first in exchange for security. People agree to follow laws, obey authority, and recognize a central power. This sovereign, the Leviathan, must be strong, even absolute, because its authority is what holds peace together. For Hobbes, weak government is no better than none at all. Power must be sufficient to enforce the contract, or it fails. Importantly, Hobbes didn't believe rulers were divine or morally superior. His justification for authority was practical, not spiritual. Government exists not to elevate virtue, but to contain chaos. The Leviathan, whether monarch or parliament, becomes the artificial soul of the state, the structure that allows people to live, trade, and trust without constant fear. This is the heart of Hobbes's political realism. He didn't believe humans were angels. He believed we were rational enough to fear death and want peace, and rational enough to know that peace requires structure. Liberty, to Hobbes, is not the absence of restraint, but the condition made possible by law. Without order, freedom collapses into violence. Without power, rights cannot be secured. Many would challenge Hobbes. Rousseau, for example, argued that Hobbes misunderstood the state of nature, that people were peaceful before society introduced inequality and competition. Others warned that Hobbes's Leviathan, if left unchecked, could become oppressive in its own right. Yet Hobbes's insight still resonates, especially when societies break down. In failed states, civil wars, or natural disasters where law disappears, Hobbes's vision no longer feels abstract, it feels real. In modern democracies, we still grapple with Hobbesian questions. How much power should the state have? What freedoms can be limited in the name of public safety? How do we balance liberty with security? We may not fully accept Hobbes's conclusions, but we live in the tensions he described. We sense that peace is not automatic. It must be made, maintained, and protected. We feel the pull between individual autonomy and collective order, and we recognize that the price of civilization is often compromise. So what of the quote, solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short? It is not merely a grim reflection. It is a warning, a picture of what life becomes without shared agreements, without restraint, without structure. Hobbes forces us to appreciate that civilization, for all its flaws, is fragile, and its absence is not liberating but terrifying. Hobbes teaches us to see society not as a burden on freedom, but as its foundation. The laws we obey, the institutions we uphold, the governments we elect, these are not luxuries. They are what stand between us and chaos. They are what keep life from reverting to desperation. In making the case for authority, Hobbes was making a deeper case for peace, and for the civic responsibility required to preserve it. And perhaps that's the enduring value of his vision. It reminds us that the order we depend on is not natural. It is constructed, maintained, vulnerable. And in recognizing this, we are called not to fear each other, but to build with each other, knowing that what protects life is not only power, but shared purpose. All that is necessary for evil to triumph is for good men to do nothing. Whether or not Edmund Burke ever wrote these exact words, the quote captures the moral core of his political philosophy, that injustice thrives not only through the actions of the wicked, but through the inaction of the righteous. It's a simple phrase, but one that cuts deep. It expresses a truth that transcends time and culture, that silence can become complicity, and that in the battles between justice and cruelty, freedom and oppression, neutrality is rarely neutral. Burke, writing in the 18th century, was deeply concerned with the moral fabric of society. He believed that liberty and civilization are not sustained by laws alone, but by the vigilance of citizens, by conscience, courage, and a sense of duty to act, even when the risks are personal. He spoke out against tyranny, whether cloaked in monarchy or masked by revolution. Though conservative in many respects, he never championed complacency. In fact, his greatest fear was not that evil would storm through the gates, but that those who knew better would choose to remain silent. Evil, in Burke's view, doesn't require massive armies or complex plans. It needs only apathy. It advances not because it is strong, but because those who could resist it choose comfort, or wait too long, or convince themselves that it isn't their place. And so, this quote, regardless of its exact origin, becomes a moral compass. It asks us not just what we stand against, but whether we're standing at all. In every era, there are forces that thrive on fear, division, and unchecked power. They succeed not merely by overpowering the good, but by outlasting them. They win because those with awareness and principles choose safety over resistance. The machinery of injustice often runs quietly, and it runs best when fueled by indifference. Burke's words remind us that to stand aside is not to stand above. There is no virtue in silence when others are suffering. To do nothing in the face of wrong is to make space for it, to let it grow, to provide it the shadows in which it can move freely. And this is not just a political idea. It is personal. In everyday life, how often do we witness cruelty, a lie, a slur, an act of injustice, and say nothing, not because we agree, but because it's easier not to get involved? How often do we convince ourselves that our silence is neutrality, when in truth it is permission? Burke's insight challenges us to think of morality as action, not abstention. True goodness is not passive. It is engaged. It is uncomfortable. It speaks when silence is safer. It intervenes when distance is easier. And in doing so, it creates a world where evil cannot move unnoticed. In modern times, this quote has been invoked across civil rights struggles, revolutions, protests, and global calls to defend truth and protect the vulnerable. It applies equally to large-scale injustice and to quiet, daily wrongs. In the digital age, its urgency only grows. With constant exposure to suffering and injustice, it's tempting to believe that awareness is enough, that seeing and sharing are forms of action, but they are not. Witnessing is not the same as intervening. Do we act? Do we speak when someone is silenced or excluded? Do we step forward when there is no applause, no audience, no guarantee of success? Evil rarely arrives with spectacle. It often begins in small policies, subtle prejudices, casual dehumanizations, the kind of things that grow when no one says, stop. Burke's warning is not a call to panic, but a call to clarity. He doesn't demand that good people win every fight, only that they show up, that they refuse to disappear when things grow tense, that their voice, their presence, their courage become the barrier between cruelty and collapse. All that is necessary for evil to triumph is for good men to do nothing, is more than a quote. It is a challenge. It asks each of us to see clearly, then to act courageously. While no one can fix everything, no one is powerless. A single voice can pierce the silence. A single act can shift the mood. And in that shift, momentum can build. Burke's insight endures because the nature of evil and the danger of doing nothing remains unchanged. So does the power of ordinary people to shape extraordinary outcomes, not by being perfect, but by refusing to look away. Happiness is not an ideal of reason, but of imagination. In this deceptively simple line, Immanuel Kant, one of the most rigorous thinkers in Western philosophy, offers a perspective on happiness that challenges many modern assumptions. We often believe that happiness can be defined, pursued, optimized, that it's a goal we can reason our way toward, like a formula. But in Critique of Practical Reason, Kant tells us otherwise. He suggests that happiness is not an ideal constructed by reason, by logic or pure understanding, but one projected by imagination. It is a picture we form, not a principle we prove. This distinction runs deep in Kant's ethics. For him, reason is the foundation of morality, the source of duty, of universal laws, of moral obligation. Reason tells us what we ought to do, regardless of what we feel or want. Happiness, by contrast, is not something reason can define for all, because it means different things to different people, even to the same person at different times. For one, it might be success. For another, peace. For another, love or adventure. Its content shifts. It resists standardization. And because of this, Kant argues, happiness cannot be the basis of moral law. We cannot ground ethics in it, because no universal definition exists. But Kant does not devalue happiness. Instead, he places it in its proper realm, the imagination. It is not a cold external object, but a warm internal projection, something we envision, hope for, fill with our own color and meaning. When we imagine a happy life, we're not solving a puzzle, we're painting a scene. We imagine fulfillment, ease, love. We picture how life might feel, not how it must be. This imaginative quality is what makes happiness beautiful and elusive, because it lives not in certainty, but in possibility. We chase it not with equations, but with longing. And because it's shaped by imagination, it's often entangled with illusion, with ideals inherited from culture, media, or others' expectations. We imagine a job, relationship, or lifestyle will make us happy, only to find that the feeling is fleeting, not because we were irrational, but because imagination can never be fully satisfied by reality. This is the bittersweet truth in Kant's quote. Happiness is rich, necessary, and deeply human. But it's not rational in the strict sense. It isn't universal, predictable, or always coherent. It cannot be legislated or used as the basis for moral worth. That's why, in Kant's ethics, the good will, the will that acts from duty, not desire, is morally superior. To act rightly, even when it brings discomfort, is to follow reason. To act rightly, only when it aligns with happiness, is to follow inclination. Yet Kant does not ask us to reject happiness. He simply asks us to see it clearly, not as a fixed destination, but as a vision, a story we tell ourselves, a hope we carry and revise as we live. This insight has profound relevance in a culture obsessed with maximizing happiness through apps, life hacks, and lifestyle choices. Kant reminds us that happiness isn't measurable, isn't controllable, isn't even fully knowable. It is something we imagine, chase, reshape, lose, and sometimes rediscover in the least expected places. And this isn't a flaw. It's what makes happiness personal. It's why we're often surprised by what actually brings us joy, and why engineered happiness often feels hollow. The imagination resists precision, and that Kant sees is the nature of happiness. It's not a rational blueprint, but an evolving story, one written in moments, feelings, meanings. Yet there's a second message here, quieter, but just as profound. By placing happiness in the realm of imagination, Kant gives us the freedom to reimagine it, to ask, what does fulfillment mean for me? Not what I was told, not what others expect, but what I feel when I allow myself to wonder. And in that space, we reclaim happiness, not as a reward, but as a relationship, not as a target, but as a dialogue with ourselves. Kant's statement also reminds us that happiness does not always align with what is right. Sometimes the most moral actions bring pain. When we speak difficult truths, sacrifice for others, stand alone for what's just. These moments may not feel good, but they reveal who we are. Kant calls us to honor them, not for pleasure, but for principle. In this way, reason and imagination each play their part. Reason gives us duty, imagination gives us direction. The art of life is holding both. Happiness is not something to be solved, but to be sensed. It is shaped daily, not by logic alone, but by memory, feeling, and hope. And perhaps that's what makes happiness so human. Not its clarity, but its mystery. Not its logic, but its longing. A man who has committed a mistake and doesn't correct it is committing another mistake. With this simple but quietly powerful sentence, Confucius, the ancient Chinese philosopher and teacher, offers not a rule, but a mirror. It reflects a timeless truth. The presence of error does not define our character. Our response to it does. Everyone makes mistakes. To live, speak, act, to be human is to risk being wrong, to misjudge, to misstep, to misunderstand. These are not failures of character. They are signs of life. What matters, Confucius tells us, is not whether we err, but whether we learn. If we don't, if we refuse to pause, reflect, and correct, the mistake deepens. It shifts from accidental to deliberate. The first mistake was human. The second is moral. Confucius believed virtue was not innate or fixed, but cultivated. His teachings focused on becoming a junzi, an exemplary person, not through perfection, but through ongoing self-improvement. And that journey begins with the willingness to recognize and correct our errors, to say, I was wrong, I misunderstood, I hurt someone, I spoke too soon. But for many, those admissions feel like weakness. We associate mistakes with shame and correction with defeat. Pride, fear, and ego conspire to keep us rigid, to protect a self-image that may no longer reflect reality. So we hide our mistakes, or worse, justify them. And in doing so, we make them permanent. What could have been a moment of growth becomes a pattern. What could have been a course correction becomes a wall. Confucius warns against this, not harshly, but with quiet wisdom. To refuse to correct a mistake is to choose error, to place pride above growth, to value image over truth. And in that choice, we don't just stagnate, we lose the chance to become better. Because every correction is a turning point, a moment of humility, a return to alignment. And the more we practice this, the more we meet mistakes with responsibility, the more we become resilient, trustworthy, wise. This teaching is especially urgent in leadership. A leader who can't admit error becomes dangerous, not because they are always wrong, but because they pretend to be always right. Their unwillingness to correct missteps harms those who follow. But a leader who admits mistakes, learns publicly, and adjusts course is one who leads with integrity. They model humility, they create space for growth, they show that truth matters more than ego. In personal relationships too, this principle holds weight. We all hurt those we care about, not from cruelty, but from blindness, distraction, misunderstanding. The harm may not be intentional, but healing begins when we see our role clearly, when we say, I see now, I can do better. That moment, the moment of correction, is the seed of trust. It shows that we value connection over being right, that we are willing to grow together. Confucius understood that the path to wisdom is not linear. It falters, loops, begins again. It is filled with stumbles, but each stumble offers a choice. Do I defend the mistake or rise from it? The error itself is not the enemy. It can be the teacher. It reveals where we were asleep. It wakes us up. It points to what we haven't yet understood, but only if we let it. Only if we resist the urge to cover it with denial, distraction, or noise. In the Confucian worldview, learning is lifelong. There is no final arrival, only the deepening of character, the refinement of thought, the effort to act in accordance with virtue, again and again. And that effort depends on how we treat error. To see mistakes as shameful is to shut the door to wisdom. To see them as opportunities is to become a student of life. In a world obsessed with perfection, where appearances are curated and mistakes punished, Confucius's teaching is quietly radical. To admit fault publicly feels risky. To correct ourselves feels vulnerable. But in truth, it is one of the strongest things we can do. It shows self-respect. It honors those around us. It invites others to do the same. A man who has committed a mistake and doesn't correct it is committing another mistake. In this sentence, Confucius offers not condemnation, but guidance. He says, "You are allowed to be wrong, but you are also responsible for what comes next. The correction is your freedom, your second chance. It is the moment when your mistake becomes your teacher, and the more you learn from it, the more you become what Confucius valued most. Not someone who never fails, but someone who never stops growing. We live in the best of all possible worlds." With this single sentence, Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz, philosopher, mathematician, theologian, entered one of the most enduring debates in Western thought. The quote is often mocked, misunderstood, or dismissed as naive optimism. How could this world, with its wars, injustice, disease, and sorrow, possibly be the best? It sounds absurd, even offensive. But Leibniz wasn't offering a feel-good slogan. He was making a claim about logic, metaphysics, and the nature of divine creation. To understand his meaning, we must begin with his view of God and reality. Leibniz believed in a rational, omniscient, omnipotent, and benevolent God. Such a being, he argued, would not create arbitrarily. Out of all the infinite worlds God could have made, he would, by necessity, choose the best one, not the perfect one. A perfect world would imply no contrast, no growth, no freedom. But the best possible one, a world that balances freedom, diversity, beauty, natural law, moral responsibility, and consequence in such a way that its total reality yields more good than any other logically consistent alternative. Leibniz's logic was not sentimental. He fully acknowledged the existence of suffering, but he argued that a world with free agents, humans capable of choosing good or evil, is better than one of puppets. A world governed by stable natural laws, where hurricanes and diseases are possible, may be necessary for order. In such a system, evil is not directly willed by God, but permitted, as part of a greater structure whose totality, from a divine perspective, produces more good than any other arrangement could. This is not an attempt to justify every instance of pain. It is a metaphysical argument about structure, not a sentimental appeal. Yet it sparked backlash, most famously from Voltaire. In Candide, Voltaire lampooned Leibniz's theory through the character of Dr. Pangloss, a man who insists that all is for the best, even as disasters and tragedies unfold around him. The satire struck a nerve. It exposed the danger of treating philosophy as dogma, of using abstract reasoning to dismiss real human grief. And yet, Leibniz never denied suffering. He simply believed that a benevolent God had reasons for allowing it, reasons possibly beyond human grasp, but not beyond divine logic. He imagined the world taken as a whole, containing a harmony, a balance, a cosmic calculus that justified its creation. This view requires trust, not blind faith, but structured hope. Whether one accepts it depends not only on logic, but on one's relationship with pain, meaning, and mystery. For some, Leibniz's optimism brings comfort, the belief that existence has purpose, that pain is not wasted, that reality bends toward meaning. For others, it feels like dismissal, a way to minimize cruelty, to avoid naming the full weight of injustice. That's why this quote continues to divide, not because it's shallow, but because its implications are vast. It is not just about theology. It is about what we believe existence is. Is the world random and broken, or ordered and meaningful? Are we left to chaos, or living within a structure where good, somehow, outweighs evil? These are not questions with easy answers, but they are questions that shape everything. How we live, how we endure, how we respond. Perhaps between Leibniz and Voltaire, we can find a middle ground. Perhaps we don't know whether this is the best possible world, but we do know it's the one we have, and how we meet its suffering matters. Perhaps we can say, this world holds both cruelty and beauty, that it permits sorrow, but also compassion, that it gives rise to the worst, but also to acts of astonishing good, and that our task is not to prove the world is best, but to help make it better. At its best, Leibniz's optimism isn't an excuse, It's an invitation to see ourselves as moral agents in a world that allows for evil, to seek virtue amid hardship, to believe that even in darkness, some structure worth preserving exists. We live in the best of all possible worlds is not a denial of pain. It is a challenge to seek purpose within it. And in that effort, whether or not Leibniz was right, we may create something that feels closer to the world we wish had been chosen, and perhaps still can be. Time is a moving image of eternity. With this haunting phrase, Plato offers not just a definition of time, but an invitation to see reality differently, to look beyond the passing moments of our lives and glimpse the stillness that lies beneath them. The quote appears in Timaeus, one of Plato's most enigmatic and cosmological dialogues, where he attempts to describe the creation of the universe, not through myth or science, but through the language of philosophy and divine geometry. For Plato, the world we perceive, the world of change, motion, and becoming, is not the most real world. It is a shadow, a reflection, a copy of something far more perfect and stable, the world of forms. In that eternal realm, concepts like beauty, justice, truth, and unity exist not as passing phenomena, but as pure, unchanging realities. Everything we see in time, a beautiful face, a just action, a fleeting truth, is but a glimpse, a diluted representation of these higher realities. Time, in this vision, is not ultimate. It is derivative. It is created, not eternal. It begins when the cosmos begins, when the divine craftsman, the demiurge, brings order to chaos. In doing so, he does not invent time as something independent. He imposes time as a rhythm that echoes eternity. It is, Plato says, a moving image, a dynamic unfolding copy of a reality that itself does not change. In eternity, there is no before or after. There is no becoming, only being. All things are present at once. Time, then, is like a shadow that flickers on the wall of a cave, while eternity is the unchanging source of light outside it. To live in time is to live in motion, always approaching, never arriving, always remembering or anticipating, never simply being. And yet, we are drawn to the eternal. We seek permanence in a world of change. We fall in love with beauty that fades. We search for truth in opinions. We build meaning in moments we know we cannot hold. Plato believed this longing was no accident. It is the mark of the soul, a reminder that we come from somewhere beyond time, and that we are more than what time can contain. The soul, in his view, is eternal. It existed before it entered the body, and it will exist after the body dies. To remember the eternal, to glimpse it, even dimly, through philosophy, through love, through contemplation, is to awaken to who we truly are. And so, when Plato says time is a moving image of eternity, he is not offering a scientific explanation. He is offering a metaphysical map, one that orients the soul not just within the cosmos, but towards something beyond it. This idea changes how we think about our days. It suggests that behind every passing hour is a stillness. Behind every change is a pattern. Behind every decision is a deeper truth trying to be remembered. We are not merely aging creatures trapped in time. We are participants in a drama that reflects a greater order. And every time we see beauty, or feel love, or act with justice, we are touching something eternal through the lens of the temporal. In modern terms, we might say, time is like music, unfolding moment by moment, but governed by structure, harmony, rhythm. It moves, but it moves in relation to something still. Eternity is that stillness. It is the key that gives time its meaning. Without it, time would be random, just motion without direction. But with eternity behind it, time becomes meaningful. It becomes the stage on which truth can be enacted, where the soul can remember what it knew before and move closer to the form of the good. This vision is not just philosophical, it is spiritual. It offers comfort in the face of change. It reminds us that not all that matters can be measured by clocks or calendars, that some of the most important things in life, love, virtue, wisdom, do not live in time at all. They appear in time, but they come from elsewhere. And they point us back to that source. Even the deepest suffering, in Plato's view, takes place within time. And so, it is not ultimate. It is part of the movement, not the stillness. It may teach, shape, refine, but it does not define us. Because our essence, the soul, is not born in time. It merely travels through it, and time itself, with all its seasons and struggles, is only a reflection, a moving image of something more perfect, more real, something that waits quietly beyond the turning of days. Time is a moving image of eternity. To meditate on this idea is to loosen our grip on the temporary, not to reject time, but to place it in perspective, to see each moment as a brushstroke in a larger design, to live more gently, more humbly, more awake, because if time is an image, then so are we, temporary reflections of something eternal trying to find its way back to the light.